Welcome to the debate. We often talk about the limits of federal power, but today we're looking at something a bit different, where the Constitution might actually, mandate federal intervention in the affairs of a state.
Exactly. We're diving into Article 4, specifically Section 4, the Guarantee Clause. Article 4 is really foundational, isn't it? It sets the operating system for the Union, how states interact, and, critically, how the federal government relates to the internal workings of the states themselves.
Right. And the specific question we're wrestling with today, and it really comes straight from the text, is this. Does Article 4, Section 4, the part that guarantees a Republican form of government to every state, does that give the federal government broad, substantive power to step into state governance to ensure that form holds up?
Or is that power much more limited? Is it, narrowly defined as more of a defensive, structural backstop only triggered under very specific reactive conditions? That's the core tension.
And I'll be arguing that the word guarantee itself imposes a necessary sort of implied authority on the federal government. It's essential for ensuring lasting Republican integrity within the states. It's a mechanism that's really vital for the whole constitutional structure.
And I'll be taking the position that the scope here is highly constrained by the text itself. The language anchors this power very firmly to defensive functions, preserving the kind of state autonomy that you see emphasized elsewhere in Article 4.
Okay, so let's lay out our positions on this. When you read Section 4, the initial weight, for me at least, falls entirely on that word guarantee. It places an active, a positive obligation on the federal system. The United States shall guarantee. It's not passive. It implies, it really mandates that the federal government must have the inherent means and authority to make sure that required political character, the Republican form, is actually maintained. If a state fails that basic constitutional test, the whole union loses its uniformity, its stability.
I approach it from a slightly different angle. If we accept that the guarantee is that broad, we then have to ask why the framers were so, careful to limit federal power in other parts of Article 4. Just look at the text right after the guarantee in Section 4 itself. It clearly links this power to reactive things, security functions, protection against invasion and against domestic violence. That context matters.
Okay.
And beyond that, the whole philosophy, you could say, of Article 4 seems to promote integration while preserving distinct state sovereignty. Look at Sections 1 and 2, full faith and credit, privileges and immunities. They require states to recognize each other's legal acts, sure, but they inherently respect the differences between state legal systems. A broad, substantive federal veto over how a state governs itself seems to cut against the very state individuality that Article 4 tries to manage.
But don't those mechanisms, full faith and credit, privileges and immunities, don't they break down without some baseline stability and legitimacy? I mean, if we expect one state to honor the court judgments of another, and if we expect citizens moving between states to, enjoy basic rights, the state they're entering has to remain stable, representative, and, reliably Republican. If governments collapses, or if, say, some oligarchy takes over behind the mask of a legislature, the whole system falters. The guarantee feels like the prerequisite for the practical stuff the union needs to do.
That's a compelling point about stability, I grant you that. But the text puts a really crucial limit on the federal government acting alone, even in a crisis. It specifically conditions intervention against domestic violence. It says it has to be on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened. That's a huge qualifier.
Yes, I absolutely agree that the application clause is a massive textual constraint on using military force for domestic violence. No question.
Precisely. So if the framers were that specific about limiting federal action requiring state consent, even when dealing with something like an armed uprising, how can we possibly infer that they just silently granted Washington this sweeping abstract power to judge and enforce the substantive quality of a state's republicanism without any similar application or trigger? The conditions placed on intervening against violence strongly suggest that enforcing the more abstract form must also be severely checked. It points towards respecting sovereignty.
Okay, and this brings us right to the core disagreement, doesn't it? The meaning of a mandatory guarantee versus those very specific conditions for intervention.
I'd argue the guarantee has to be paramount. The federal government must possess the inherent power to judge if a state has fundamentally stopped being Republican, because the structure of the Constitution demands it. Think about Reconstruction, for instance. If the state government itself is the problem, if it's actively undermining representative government, how does the Union fulfill its constitutional duty if it has to wait for the very people causing the problem to ask for help?
I just don't buy that this implies a power to dictate the substance of state laws, to let the federal government define what counts as a Republican form in a substantive way, like, ruling on specific election procedures or who gets to vote. That essentially hands Congress a political club to use against state choices it doesn't like. I see the guarantee as purely structural. It ensures, yes, that there's a representative body, that basic procedures are followed, but it doesn't empower Congress to start grading the fairness or the wisdom of state laws. The founders were, frankly, terrified of a central government faction imposing its political views on the state's internal affairs.
That fear is definitely real. I concede that. But the failure to act also has massive consequences. The inability of the federal government to ensure adherence to fundamental principles, even if state officials are complicit in undermining that Republican form, that's a structural failure too. The guarantee is structural oversight, yes, but surely that oversight has to extend to protecting the integrity of the system itself. The system that allows a state government to be legitimately called Republican. It's got to be about more than just checking if there's a governor in a building called the State House. It's about whether that framework is fundamentally working as intended.
Well, if your interpretation holds that the guarantee allows for this broad substantive judgment, then why is the language so dramatically different between Section 4 and Section 3? Let me point you to Section 3, which deals with new states and, crucially, territories. This section gives Congress incredibly explicit and broad authority. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States.
All needful rules and regulations. Yes, that's clear, broad legislative power over territories.
Exactly. Contrast that language, clear, explicit, broad regulatory power, with the, frankly, conditional and defensive language used just one section later in Section 4 regarding existing states. The fact that such expansive, explicit legislative authority is missing in Section 4 when talking about internal state affairs strongly suggests a deliberate choice, a deliberate limitation on federal power over established states. They knew how to grant broad power when they wanted to, like with territories, and they chose not to do it here for the states under the guarantee clause. It tells you something about their view of established states versus territories.
I acknowledge the textual difference, of course, but these powers serve entirely different functions, don't they? Congressional power over territory is, well, almost proprietary. It's about managing property, setting things up. The guarantee power in Section 4 is mandatory, it's constitutional, it's about preserving the required political character of the Union's existing members. The necessity of protecting the entire Union, I think, requires the federal government to police fundamental constitutional adherence within the states. That feels like a higher, more critical duty than just managing territories.
But that need to police internal adherence has to be weighed against the principle of state autonomy, which is also deeply embedded in Article 4, Section 3. Again, it emphasizes state integrity by restricting how new states can be formed within the jurisdiction of existing ones without consent. There's a clear theme of respecting existing state boundaries and governance throughout the article. So a broad reading of Section 4, one that allows the federal government to assess the substantive fairness of state governance, seems to fundamentally contradict that spirit of reserving internal matters to the states.
That the sheer complexity of modern interstate life, the way we rely on recognition across borders, it almost necessitates this federal check. Let's move maybe beyond abstract principles for a second. Contention 3 here. Consider a practical scenario. If a state descends into chaos, or maybe tyranny, making its courts unreliable, its laws unpredictable, how can citizens from other states then be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states when they travel or do business there? Doesn't the federal government have to have the power under the guarantee clause to step in? To protect the rights of its other citizens who are depending on that state being functional and Republican? The failure of one state can infect the others.
You raise a critical point about protecting out-of-state citizens, absolutely. However, Sections 1 and 2 already recognize and, frankly, tolerate huge differences between states. One state has to recognize the legal acts of another, yes, but it doesn't have to adopt the same policies on, say, taxes or environmental rules or anything else. The whole system of federalism presupposes legal diversity, legal individuality among the states. So a narrow structural reading of Section 4 ensures stability. It ensures there's a functioning representative government structure in place, without crushing that state individuality, which Article 4 seems designed precisely to protect.
But what happens if that structure is kept purely as a facade? We circle back to the political reality. What if a state legislature keeps all the outward signs of power, but uses that power to systematically make elections meaningless, to effectively disenfranchise most of its people, making the form essentially hollow? Does the federal duty to guarantee just evaporate then? I'd argue the duty is to ensure the integrity of the Republican form, which requires a proactive constitutional guardianship, not just waiting for a total collapse or an invitation.
I understand the concern, I really do. But that line of reasoning moves us squarely into the realm of political questions, the very kind the framers, I believe, wanted to keep away from unilateral federal judgment. Allowing the federal government to become the ultimate judge of internal political fairness, that grants Congress, or maybe the president, a kind of veto over fundamental state political choices. And that veto seems entirely unsupported by the cautious, constrained text of Section 4, especially when you contrast it, again, with the explicit power over territories in Section 3. Those limitations placed on intervention against domestic violence, requiring the state's application, remain the clearest signal that state consent, state sovereignty, is vital to maintaining the intended balance, even under this promise of a guarantee.
Well, for me, the necessity of the union's longevity, its functional coherence, really hinges on a robust reading of Section 4. The federal duty to guarantee a Republican form has to be more than just symbolic. It must provide that necessary check against internal disintegration, the kind of check that underpins the reliability needed for Sections 1 and 2 to even work.
And I have to reiterate that the explicit limits, the conditional nature of the protection clauses right there in Section 4, especially the application requirement for intervening in a crisis, demand a more restrained, a defensive interpretation. An interpretation that honors the clear respect for state integrity shown elsewhere in Article 4, preserving that crucial, if sometimes difficult, balance between federal oversight and state sovereignty.
It's clear we both agree that Article 4 does quite elegantly frame this critical, ongoing tension between federal necessity and state independence. The question really hangs in the air. Who ultimately gets to decide when a state government stops being truly Republican?
And that decision, rooted entirely in how we read this surprisingly compact text, carries immense practical weight for how we define American federalism. It's a tension, as you say, that we are certainly still grappling with today.